Hi, this is Rishabh Rajan, and this is a review on the Arturia Micro Freak. The Micro Freak is pretty unique, at least for Arturia. This is their first digital synthesizer, or at least a synthesizer which has a digital oscillator. It's pretty versatile and comes in at a very good price point. The hardware build is pretty solid, the knobs feel good, you get some endless encoders. I'll talk about my issues with these a bit later, but it's mostly all good. In terms of connectivity, you get CV, gate and pressure out, clock in and out, as well as MIDI in and out. The MIDI in-out is on 1/8 inch jacks, but you do get adapters in the box. There is a USB jack for MIDI and power, but it does not do audio. There is no audio input, but you do get 1/4 inch mono audio out and a stereo headphone out as well. Alright, let's now check out the audio engine on this synthesizer. As I mentioned before, this has one digital oscillator, but it has 12 different modes, so plenty to play around with, and Arturia does plan to add on more in future firmware upgrades. You get 3 different controls over here for each of the modes. We'll get back to this later on. Moving along, there's this analog filter, the only analog aspect of the synth. You get 3 different modes here, cutoff resonance controls, pretty straightforward. You get 2 envelopes here, a mean amp envelope here, which can also be assigned to the filter with this style, and then a cycling envelope. So this can be a standard one-shot envelope or can be cycled. A standard LFO here with 6 different shapes, a rate control which can be synced, and this LFO can be assigned to a variety of different destinations. There's also an amp and sequencer section built in. And then of course there's this keyboard. It's a touch capacitive keyboard with pressure and touch sensitivity. It can do velocity or aftertouch, and specifically polyphonic aftertouch. Now, unlike a standard keyboard, Aftertouch works a bit different here. It depends on how much of your finger is in contact with the circuit board. Now, right now it's not making any difference because we're on an initialized preset, but later on I'll give you a demonstration of this. Then right above we have some controls for the sequencer and the Arpeggiator. Alright, so one nice aspect of this synth is that you get tons of really good presets. And as you can hear now, it's polyphonic, or paraphonic as they call it here. So if I turn off this switch, the synth goes to regular monophonic mode. Let's try another preset. So you get a maximum of 4 notes of polyphony. Alright, I'm going to switch over to this initialized preset that I created. And let's now check out the different oscillator modes. Let's start off with the first basic waves type. So as I mentioned, there are 3 different controls for each type. The first one here, wave, morphs from this square waveform to the sawtooth. And then at the highest, moves up to a sawtooth an octave above. With the octave control here, we can go down to the lowest note. And this would be the highest note we could produce here. Pretty clean sound for a digital synth. Alright, next, let's check out the timbre control. So this changes the pulse width on that square wave to get this nice narrow pulse tone. But if we had a sawtooth waveform, it kind of adds this hard sync-like tonality to the sound, albeit a bit subtle. Alright, let's now talk about these endless encoders. They can be pretty helpful, but when you have a very wide range, it can take quite a few twists to get to the lowest or the highest end of a control. Typically on an analog synth, you want to be able to quickly reach that highest and lowest end to really hear the range of a particular control. Alright, the last shape control here just introduces a sub-oscillator. Pretty decent sound here. Let's run it through the analog filter. So this is an SEM style 12 dB per octave resonant analog filter. That was the low pass mode. Let's add some resonance and have a listen to this. It does produce that self-oscillation, but unfortunately there's no way to isolate this because we cannot mute the oscillator section. Let's try the bandpass mode. Let's try it in paraphonic mode, so I can play up to 4 notes simultaneously. And then lastly, the high pass mode. A lot of fun this filter is. Let's talk a bit more about this paraphonic mode. So when it's off, we're in monophonic mode. But when we turn it on, we have 4 voices for the digital oscillator. It's still just one filter, one LFO, one cycling envelope, but we do get independent amp envelopes for each of the voices. Let's play with this envelope to demonstrate that. I'll increase the attack time here. There's an amp mod on-off button here, so let's make sure that's on. So some attack, decay and release on the same dial. I'll bring the sustain down. So now we have this relatively long amp envelope. In monophonic mode, you can hear the envelope does not restart, and it really exposes the fact that we just have this one envelope. But in paraphonic mode, let's say if I play one note here, and if I bring in a new note, and if I take it away, you can clearly hear each voice has its own amp envelope. So I'm not sure how this is happening, so it's kind of like a polyphonic synth, even though they call it paraphonic. But either way, the summary is that we get 4 notes polyphony. Let's move on and check out another mode here. So this is the supersaw mode. Let's switch to polyphonic mode to hear this. Nice, rich, detuned chords. We can filter it. Now one thing that's a bit of a bummer is that the output is monophonic. So even though we have this nice rich sound, we can't hear it in stereo. With the wave dial here, we can change the waveform of the super wave. There's a detune amount. And then there's a volume control. So there's a volume control for the detuning. So if I have a lot of detuning, but the volume set very low, you'll barely hear that. But then I can increase this, and we hear a lot of detuning. But again, it's in mono. Anyway, while we're here, let's talk about modulation. So there's a modulation matrix here. So any of these 5 sources can be assigned to any of these destinations. The last 3 here are user assignable. So let's say I want to modulate the filter cutoff. Let's say with the LFO. So on the matrix, I just have to find that point on the XY grid. Here's the dial here. So let's find that position. We have LFO here and cutoff on the y-axis here. Push the button, and now we see the amount here on the screen. Let's increase that. I'll set the cutoff to the center. We should now hear the LFO modulate the filter cutoff. It's synced to BPM, but I can push this rate dial and switch it to free mode. It goes pretty fast in free mode. You can get a nice grungy tone like this. I always appreciate an LFO that goes into audio rate, even if it's just a little bit. Now here we can clearly hear all the different voices getting that same LFO modulation. So that goes more towards the paraphonicness of the synth. Still pretty cool, but again, it's really a bummer that we don't have a stereo output on this synth, because I don't know about you, but I prefer my supersaw sound to be in stereo. Alright, let's check out another oscillator mode. The next one here is Wavetable. Now you notice that modulation is still assigned, so even though I've changed the oscillator mode, the modulation stays, even if the parameter changes. Well, the cutoff always stays the same, but if I make any assignments on the digital oscillator itself, that will also stay. So let's first disable this filter cutoff modulation. I just have to find it and push and hold this button, And now it disables that parameter, so I don't have to twist it 100 times. Okay, so now this is the wavetable mode. I'll open up the filter cutoff. The wave dial will switch between the different wavetables itself. Let me reset this amp envelope. And with the timbre dial, we can change the wavetable position. The last dial here adds chorusing. Alright, so I'll get rid of the chorusing and let's modulate the wavetable position dial. Probably the most obvious thing to do on a wavetable engine. Let's work with this one. Now to assign this, I just have to find it here in the matrix. And let's use the cycling envelope for this. Found it, push the dial, rotate to increase the amount, and now it's assigned. There's an amount control on the envelope itself, so you can think of this as a global amount control for the cycling envelope. Let's give it a shape. So we have rise and fall time, and then the hold or sustain stage. Let's try a different wavetable. Not bad. Let's try the looping mode. So in run mode, the envelope is expected to loop. Let me shorten the length a bit here. Now we can hear it rotate. You can make this loop really short and get some interesting new textures, just like having a really fast LFO. Now run and loop both loop, but the main difference between them is regarding retriggering. So in loop mode, the envelope always retriggers. But in run mode, every time I press a new key, the cycling envelope doesn't care, it's going to keep running freely. Alright, let's disable this modulation, and let's try the same thing with the LFO instead. I'll increase the amount here. I'm using a sine wave shape. Let's slow it down a bit. Alright, now we can hear the movement. Alright, let's now change the shape to a square wave. So you would expect it to jump between two positions, but that's not what's happening. Let's slow down further. So it sounds like there's some kind of interpolation happening between the two positions. Sounds more like a triangle than a square. Now this is not the fault of the LFO, it's that wavetable itself. Let's try modulating a different parameter. I'll disable this one. Let's assign it to shape. Now we don't have shape as an option, so we can manually assign it. If I select assign one, you can see it's assigned to sustain. And I'm not even sure which sustain they're talking about here. But let's replace it by holding down this button and twisting the dial. And now you can see it's assigned to shape. Oh, I lost that. Let me head back in here. Now it says VCO parameter 3, which is shape here. I'll increase the amount. And now the LFO is going to affect the shape control, which adds that chorusing. Interestingly, even here we're having that interpolation type effect. So this might be the whole wavetable mode itself. Let's try a different mode. How about this harmonic one? Alright, you can hear a clear-cut switch there. Let's try another one. Let's go back to super waves. Yeah, you can clearly hear it's jumping between those two positions. Basic waves. Same thing here. The sub-octave turns on and then turns off. So yeah, it's definitely just a wavetable thing, that interpolation effect. Another point I was alluding to earlier is that as you change the different modes, those modulation assignments stay. So I have a modulation assignment on shape, and irrespective of which oscillator type I'm in, that modulation stays. Alright, pretty cool. We're not done yet, still many more oscillator types to go through. Let's look at harmonic. This one is interesting. I'll disable the modulation there. So I'll set all these dials back to default. So we get this very basic tone. Seems to be like a very filtered square / triangle type tone. Now if I increase this wave parameter, we're adding more harmonic content, but at the same time we're also removing some of the lower harmonic content. And this one is called sculpting. You can think of this more like wave shaping, and you can see in the oscilloscope that's shaping the wave. And the last, shape control, adds chorusing. So just be aware that the three parameters are not always the same for the different oscillator modes. Alright, moving along. The next mode is the carpless strong mode. I like this mode. So physical modeling mode. We get the bowing / striking control here. When it's all the way down, we essentially get a strike. And with the second control, we can adjust the tonality of that strike. And then there's this overall decay control here. This might be a nice sound to try out the Arpeggiator with. There's a hold option, so I don't have to hold the keys down. We can change the direction of the arpeggiation. It's up right now. We can change to order in which it was played. We also have random. And then there's this pattern mode, which is semi-random, depending on new notes being played in. We have octave controls here. So instead of just staying within the octaves played, it can go up even higher. With this dial here, I can assign the envelope to the filter cutoff. A bit hard to hear this in the carpless strong mode, but if I crank up the resonance, it'll be a bit more obvious. Maybe this decay control can be modulated over time. Let's use the LFO for that. Assign 1 is already set to VCO parameter 3, which is a decay control here in the carpless strong mode. Let's go with a random shape LFO for this. Now there's also a sequencer. We can access the sequencer by tapping Shift and the R button. There's already a sequence running in here. There's also a sequence B, so you get two sequences. That's the play button, you can stop it there. And then there's some interesting parameters here that can add some randomization to a pattern, and we can use this touch strip here to affect that. By default, it's in bend mode for pitch bend effects, but I can switch this to spice or dice. So spice is another randomization effect for the gates and triggers of the sequencer. And with the dice, you can change up the randomization patterns. So when spice is all the way down, you're not going to hear anything. But if you bring it up, you'll hear maximum randomization. And then with the dice parameter, you can change up the randomization pattern. I guess it's kind of useful, but I haven't found this to be that dramatic in terms of the change it introduces. But either way, it's an interesting parameter to have on a synth and worth experimenting with. Now I can clear out a sequence by tapping and holding these two buttons together. So now if I play the sequence, oh, didn't work. Let's do that once again. Yeah, when you see the lights flash, you know it's cleared out. Alright, so let's record something into the sequence. I can hit the record button here and just play notes in. Now unfortunately, there is no metronome or timing reference, so there's no way to perform in something accurately. So it can be a bit tricky to live perform in patterns. But there's also step record mode. In step record mode, just hit the record button, don't hit the play button, and just play in the notes. You can add rests by tapping this button. And so now we can add in notes offline. And then hit the play button to hear the pattern. Let's add in some glide. Change up the tonality of the sound a bit. And now that we have something recorded, I can go ahead and real-time record in some new notes. I have a reference of the existing pattern, so it makes it a bit easier. So now I've added a few more notes. Now another cool thing is that we can actually record modulation in this sequencer. So it's fairly straightforward. Hit the record button and start tweaking a dial. I can record up to 4 different parameters. You can see in these 4 LEDs here, the first 2 are blinking. So I've used up the first 2 slots. So now the cutoff and resonance tweaks are part of the sequence. So a lot of fun you can have with the sequencer. And you probably realize this is a pretty deep synthesizer. And we haven't covered all the different oscillator modes yet. The next one here is the virtual analog mode. There's a detune control, shape control, and that's adding in another lower register. We can run this through the filter. Let's hear this with the sequencer. Next is the wave shaper algorithm. You can choose different waveforms here. Amount of wave shaping and asymmetry. Classic FM mode. It's a 2-operator FM engine with ratio, amount, and feedback controls. There's this interesting formant mode that uses granular synthesis. So a different flavor to formant synthesis. You get an interval control, formant, and an overall shape control. Next there's chords mode. So I'll stop the sequencer for this. So in this mode, when I hold down a note, we hear a chord. We can change the chord with this dial. We get an inversion control. It kind of morphs between the different inversions. And then there's a waveform control there. And next there's this pretty quirky speech synthesis mode. There's some pre-programmed phrases that you can trigger. As you can hear, it says electronic machine, frequency, I guess that's cool. Next, there's this modal engine. This would probably sound nice with the Arpeggiator. We can use this to simulate some of those bell-like percussive tones. Has a bit of that FM flavor to it. Alright, before we wrap this one up, I want to give you a quick demonstration of the Aftertouch on this keyboard. So this patch uses pressure to control a couple of different aspects of the synth. So depending on how much my finger is touching that particular key, we get change in tonality. Let's try this in paraphonic mode. You'll notice that for each note, this Aftertouch works independently. So it's kind of like polyphonic Aftertouch. And polyphonic Aftertouch keyboards are very rare, so this is a very cool feature on the Micro Freak. So that's most of the parameters on the synth. There isn't an effects section, which is a bit of a bummer. Since this is a digital synth, it could have been fairly straightforward to add in an effects section. But aside from that, this is quite an interesting synth, and considering the price point, it's definitely worth looking into. I hope you found this review useful. This is Rishabh Rajan for Ask.Audio signing off, and I'll see you in the next one.